An ordinary day in Los Angeles turns into legend when an arrogant bus driver crosses paths with a seemingly harmless passenger, Steven Seagal. A comment, a spilled coffee, and an instant later, a silence heavier than violence. What seemed like a simple public humiliation unleashes a chain of events that exposes the quiet man's hidden past. Behind that calm is a former cop, a ghost, a vigilante tired of the noise. And while the city laughs at the viral video, he prepares to prove that some mistakes are paid for without shouting, only with silence. It was 7:45 a.m. in the heart of Los Angeles, a city that never fully wakes up, only changes its noise. The sun bounced off windshields, traffic lights flickered through the haze of smoke, and the cries of street vendors mingled with the roar of engines. It was the hour of traffic, of weariness, and of bad tempers. In the midst of that chaos, Steven Seagal waited for his bus, motionless, silent, like a shadow the day had yet to unveil. He wore a light black jacket, dark glasses, and worn jeans. His demeanor was calm, but something about his posture, too upright, too controlled, made people move aside without knowing why. Around him, the others waited impatiently. Office workers, students, an old man with a cane, and a boy with a tattered backpack, all prisoners of the clock. Steven, on the other hand, seemed outside of time. Bus 42 arrived with a sharp screech and a puff of gray smoke. The doors opened with a hiss, and the interior heat escaped like a weary sigh. At the wheel was Clint Jacobs, a burly man in his 40s, his face puffy with sleep, dark circles under his eyes, and a cap tilted askew on his forehead. His uniform shirt was unbuttoned, stained with coffee. His gaze held that mixture of old anger and bitter routine that only unrewarding work can carve into a man. "Come on, move it," he shouted, slamming his open palm on the steering wheel. "I don't have all day." The line moved slowly. People boarded, wary of his voice. Each ticket that fell into the machine sounded like a coin thrown into a bottomless pit. When it was Steven's turn, the driver looked him up and down in annoyance. He didn't recognize him. Of course, to him, he was just another unfriendly-looking passenger. "Are you going to pay, or do you think this is a luxury taxi?" Clint snapped, flicking his fingers across the fare machine. Steven didn't answer. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the exact fare, and dropped it in without a word. The metal clicked dryly. Then he nodded and walked to the back of the bus. That calmness, that quiet, unhurried way of moving, irritated Clint immediately. He couldn't explain it, but he felt it as a provocation, as if that man were reminding him, without saying so, that there was something inside him he no longer knew how to control. The bus started with a thud. Outside, the sun was already blazing, but inside, a dreary yellow light filtered through the dirty curtains. The city drifted past. The windows, food stalls, graffiti, children crossing the street, sirens in the distance, and in the rearview mirror, Steven's figure, motionless, hands on his knees, his gaze fixed on the street. Clint watched him in the mirror again and again. That guy made him nervous. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even sigh. He just existed serenely, as if the chaos didn't touch him. And for a man like Clint, that was unbearable. "What's wrong with you, man?" he muttered to himself. "Think you're better than everyone else?" No one answered him. Of course. The traffic crawled along. At each stop-up, more people got on. Mothers with children, construction workers in hard hats, young people glued to their phones. The air thickened with the smell of sweat, cheap deodorant, and frustration. Clint huffed and puffed, honking the horn, muttering insults under his breath. Every second was an affront. At the third stop, a teenager tripped, and his backpack fell at Stephen's feet. The boy mumbled an apology. Stephen bent down, picked up the backpack, and handed it back to him with a friendly gesture. "Thank you, sir," the young man said. "You're welcome," Stephen replied, barely moving his lips. From the mirror, Clint saw the movement. A large man standing up in the middle of the aisle. His mind, already clouded with irritation, interpreted it differently. "Hey!" he roared from the front. "Hey, you, the one in the back, what's going on back there? Any trouble?" The bus fell silent. All eyes turned to Stephen, who was still standing. Calm. "No problem," he said in a low but firm voice. Clint gave a dry chuckle. "Yeah, that's what all the troublemakers say." He raised his voice. "Sit down and stop playing the hero." "Did you hear me?" A couple of passengers laughed nervously. Others looked down. Nobody wanted to be in the middle. Stephen sat down without answering. He stared out the window. Outside, a pigeon walked across a puddle of oil. The sun reflected the city in metallic tones. Clint watched him from the rearview mirror, seething with anger. He couldn't stand this lack of reaction. Stephen's calmness was like a mirror showing him everything he lacked, and insecure men can't stand reflections. "Look at him," the driver muttered, sitting there, as if nothing bothered him. He jerked the steering wheel. The bus lurched, and several passengers groaned. "Hold on." "This isn't a walk in the park," Stephen yelled. He didn't move. The bus screeched to a halt at the next light. The sound of compressed air filled the silence. Sweat trickled down Clint's neck. The rearview mirror kept reflecting the same serene face of the passenger, and it was driving him crazy. A woman sitting near the front spoke to him in a tired voice. "Sir, could you slow down? There are children on board." "Want to drive, ma'am?" he grumbled. "Because I don't get paid to be nice." The woman fell. The atmosphere grew thick, tense, fragile. Stephen turned his head just a few degrees, watching the scene from afar, without intervening. He remembered his mother's words. When a man needs to shout to feel strong, he's already lost the fight. He took a deep breath. That was all. The bus started moving again. Clint took a sip of coffee from his thermal mug and looked in the mirror again. There was Stephen, motionless. That stillness gnawed at him. It was like staring at a mountain that wouldn't budge even if the world crumbled around him. "Hey, you," he said suddenly, barely turning his head. "What's your problem?" You've been staring at me the whole way here like you're judging me." The bus fell silent again. Stephen looked up without taking off his glasses. His voice was a whisper that everyone heard. "I'm not judging you. You're already judging me." The words hung in the air. It wasn't a shout. It was worse. A truth. And the passengers felt it like a slap in the face. Clint gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, the light turned green. It didn't move. "What did you say?" he whispered. Stephen didn't repeat himself, just lowered his gaze and fell silent again. The traffic behind began to honk. Clint slammed on the wheel, accelerating sharply. The bus roared forward. A child cried. A coffee cup trembled in a hand, and in the rearview mirror, the calm remained, unshaken. At the next stop, Clint slammed on the brakes and stood up. His boots echoed in the aisle. The passengers stared at him, a mixture of curiosity and fear in their eyes. He walked backward, holding his nearly empty cup. "You think you're funny, old man?" he said, stopping in front of Stephen. Stephen slowly looked up. He said nothing. Clint smiled disdainfully. Let's see if you're still so calm after this. Without thinking, he poured the rest of the coffee directly onto Steven Seagal's chest. The hot liquid stained his black jacket, ran down his arm, and dripped to the floor. If you don't want to miss our content, hit the like button and subscribe below. Also, turn on notifications and tell us where you're listening from. We appreciate your support. The silence inside the bus was so thick, you could hear the traffic light ticking. Outside, the traffic continued to roar, but inside, the world had stopped. The coffee was still dripping from Steven Seagal's chest, forming a small, dark puddle on the metal floor. No one was breathing. No one was moving. The driver, Clint Jacobs, stood with the empty cup in his hand, his face tense, his eyes defiant, like a cornered dog unsure whether to attack or flee. Steven slowly looked up. His glasses reflected Clint's face, sweaty and trembling, trying to hold on to the courage that was already slipping away. Steven's voice was soft, without anger or haste, but so firm it cut through the air like a knife. I warned you not to do it. Clint gave a nervous, hollow laugh. So what, are you going to hit me? He said, searching his voice for strength. Come on, big guy. Show them how a guy like you behaves when someone tells him the truth. Steven didn't get up. He just watched. His stillness was more dangerous than any violent gesture. The passengers felt it. The woman in the seat in front clutched her purse to her chest. A young man silently recorded with his cell phone, his lens fixed on the aisle. Come on, what's wrong? Clint continued, trying to maintain control. You're not that tough. Do something. But Steven didn't move. He didn't need to. When he finally spoke, he did so quietly that everyone had to lean forward slightly to hear. Men like you, what? Clint interrupted. They mistake noise for respect, Steven finished. The words hit harder than any fist. Clint opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Sweat trickled down his 100. The engine was still running, vibrating like a heart beating too fast. Then, an old man in the back muttered, "Leave it, man, it's not worth it." Clint whirled around furiously. "Shut up!" he shouted, his face red, his voice trembling with rage. "Nobody tells me how to drive my bus." But it was too late. The balance had been broken. That old man's voice had put into words what everyone was thinking, and Clint felt it. The respect he'd never had was slipping through his fingers. Steven stood up calmly. The soft sound of his boots touching the ground was more threatening than any shout. He took 2 steps forward, without looking up, without hurrying. The driver instinctively stepped back. "Sit down," Clint ordered, trying to sound authoritative, but his voice cracked at the end. Steven didn't stop. Each step was measured, precise, like a metronome marking the end of something inevitable. When they were face to face, barely a meter separated them. The warmth of the sun streamed through the side window, illuminating the steam rising from the spilled coffee. The scene seemed straight out of a movie, but none of those present were breathing enough to truly feel it. "Do you know who I am?" Steven asked slowly. Clint shrugged, trying to laugh. "What? Some guy who thinks he's better than everyone else?" Steven slowly lowered his glasses. His gaze was cold, deep, unwavering. A different kind of silence filled the bus. It was the kind of silence that precedes understanding or fear. The passengers looked at each other. Someone murmured, "It's him. It's Steven Seagal." Clint blinked, confused. "What did you say?" The voice came from the back of a woman who had recognized him from the movies on the local channels. "It's Steven Seagal," she repeated, a thread of astonishment in her voice. The murmurs multiplied. The name traveled through the bus like lightning. The driver turned his head toward him and suddenly saw him, really saw him. His calm expression, his firm bearing, his gaze that could pierce a man's soul without raising his voice. And in that instant, he recognized him. Pride pricked his chest like a thorn. He tried to maintain his composure. "So, what if you are?" he said with a crooked smile. "You're not in a movie here. I'm in charge here." Stephen barely inclined his head. "No, Clint. Nobody's in charge here." "What?" "Only respect. And you lost that a long time ago." The words were like a mirror held up to him. Clint swallowed. The trembling in his hands became visible. Suddenly, the empty cup he was still holding began to vibrate between his fingers. The passengers watched, mesmerized. Some filmed, others simply observed with the same mixture of fear and admiration. The young man with the cell phone, without realizing it, had steady hands recording what would become a viral video hours later. Stephen didn't need to move anymore. He just leaned slightly toward the driver and whispered, "If your job ever makes you forget you're serving people, you're not driving a bus. You're dragging your ego around town." Clint took a step back. The cup fell to the floor. The sound of metal hitting the floor echoed like a dry gunshot. The air was released. A murmur rippled through the seats. A woman sobbed. A child said quietly, "The coffee man is mean." That was what finally broke something inside Clint. The rearview mirror reflected his own face, ravaged, sweaty, aged. For the first time, he saw himself as he truly was. But the shame, instead of soothing him, set him ablaze. The anger returned with a vengeance. "That's enough," he shouted, shoving Stephen with his shoulder. The movement was clumsy, uncontrolled. Stephen barely swayed. His hand rose with unbearable calm, touching Clint's chest to steady him. It wasn't a blow, almost a gesture of compassion. "Don't do that," he said in a warning voice, without raising it. Clint tried to push him again, but he couldn't. The mere touch of Stephen's hand stopped him completely. It was as if an invisible wall held him down. The passengers were speechless. The air vibrated with the tension of something sacred, something that shouldn't be broken. Stephen withdrew his hand and returned to his seat without looking back. The driver stood frozen in the middle of the aisle, breathing heavily. The murmurs multiplied, but he didn't hear them. He only heard his own rapid breathing, his own heart pounding in his chest like a runaway drum. The bus continued on its way, clumsy and shaky. No one spoke, no one dared to look at the driver. The midday sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the dried coffee droplets on Stephen's jacket. After a few minutes, the bus stopped at a traffic light. Traffic was building up ahead. Clint looked in his mirror again. Stephen was still, observing the scenery, as if nothing had happened. That indifference tore him apart. Not because it was contempt, but because it was peace. And another man's peace can be the cruelest mirror for someone at war with themselves. "You're not going to get away with this," Clint muttered. It was barely audible. But deep down, he knew he'd already done it. A woman in the seat in front of him looked at him coldly. "You should apologize," she said. Clint didn't reply. "The whole bus saw it," another passenger added. Clint gripped the steering wheel. "Everyone be quiet." The bus continued its route under the relentless sun, but something had changed. The respect Clint thought he commanded had evaporated. Authority, his favorite mask, had crumbled before everyone's eyes. And while he tried to hide his trembling, a camera silently continued recording from the back. Every word, every gesture, every second. Outside, the city went on. unaware that inside that bus, a lesson was about to begin. Because what Clint had awakened wasn't just a man's composure, it was the silent justice of someone who had seen too many times what happens when respect dies. And in Steven Seagal's calm gaze, the conflict had only just begun. The clock on the dashboard read 11:01 a.m., but time inside the bus seemed suspended. The air conditioning was barely working. The smell of hot metal and stale coffee filled the air. Each passenger breathed carefully, as if a louder sound could shatter the fragile balance that remained. Driver Clint Jacobs was speechless, but not without pride. And pride, when it mixes with shame, it's a bomb that just needs one more moment of silence to explode. Steven Seagal sat calmly, gazing out the window. His dark glasses rested in the pocket of his stained jacket, and his face showed no trace of anger, only concentration. It was the calm of someone who had learned the hard way that violence never begins with a fist. It begins with disrespect. The bus moved along a wide avenue, filled with traffic and honking horns. The murmurs had turned into stifled sighs. A 7-year-old boy watched Steven from his seat, as if he were watching a superhero, waiting for his next move. Suddenly, a police car cut across in the opposite lane. Its siren wailed in the distance. That sound stirred something in Clint. A memory, an old rage, an open wound. "They're all the same," he muttered. "They think they can do whatever they want." No one understood who he was referring to, but Steven did. He could recognize the tone of resentment. It was the tone of men who had been frustrated for so long that life had become a burden to them. It became an excuse to hurt others. Clint jerked the steering wheel. The bus lurched. The passengers screamed. A woman stumbled against her seat. The old man in the back banged his cane against the floor. "Watch out, man," someone yelled. "He's going to kill us," said another. But the driver wasn't listening. Or perhaps he was listening too much. But he couldn't stop now. The sound of the engine was his refuge, the chaos, his only way of feeling in control. Steven stood up slowly, not out of anger, but out of necessity. His body moved with almost choreographic precision, not wasting a single gesture. "Sit down," Clint yelled at him in the rearview mirror. "This is my bus." "Your bus?" "Yes," Steven replied, walking slowly forward. "But it's their lives you're carrying. Don't let me down, then drive properly." That sentence was the spark. Clint twisted the steering wheel furiously, trying to intimidate him, and the bus veered into the oncoming lane. The passengers screamed, the tires squealed. A car honked just before narrowly avoiding them. The vehicle's heart roared with metallic fury. Steven took a step forward, barely holding onto the back of a seat. His voice remained calm, but this time it sounded deeper, more resonant. "Slow down, Clint." "Shut up," the driver yelled. "You don't give me orders." The engine whined. The dashboard lights flickered. The world outside blurred. "Clint." Steven called out his name with such force that the entire bus seemed to hear him. "If you don't stop, I will." Absolute silence. The passengers held their breath. The boy in the back seat squeezed his mother's hand. The old man murmured a prayer. Clint pressed the accelerator. The speedometer climbed. 60, 70, 80. The streets of Los Angeles transformed into a tunnel of noise and light. That's when Steven moved. One step, one hand on the seatback, a precise turn. Before anyone could understand, Steven was right next to the driver. He didn't hit him, didn't push him, just grabbed the steering wheel. The bus skidded to one side. The sound of tires tearing through the asphalt filled the air. Steven twisted the wheel with controlled force, straightening the vehicle just before it hit a pole. The bus screeched to a halt in the middle of the avenue. The metallic screech faded into a silence so pure it hurt. Clint was breathing heavily, his eyes wide. "What? What did you do?" he stammered. Stephen looked at him. "I saved you from yourself." The engine died. Only ragged breaths, the murmur of distant traffic, and the invisible pulse of something deeper could be heard. "Shame." A passenger shouted, "Crazy, you were going to kill us." Another added, "You bastard, look what you did." The voices multiplied, and for the first time, they weren't on Clint's side. He tried to defend himself. "It was this guy's fault. He interfered with my work, but no one listened." The crowd had instinctively decided who represented order and who represented chaos. And Stephen, without saying a word, became the moral compass for them all. Clint tried to regain control of the steering wheel, but Stephen placed a hand on his arm. His gesture was firm, but not violent. "Don't do it, Clint," he said with a calmness that was worse than any threat. "You've done enough damage already." The driver stopped. His eyes flickered. Sweat dripped in large drops onto the dashboard. A woman approached the front. "Sir, can we get off?" Stephen nodded. He opened the doors manually, turning the lever with an ease that contrasted sharply with Clint's clumsiness. The fresh air rushed in like a breath of freedom. One by one, the passengers began to disembark. No one spoke to the driver. As they passed Stephen, some thanked him quietly. The boy, before getting off, looked at him with admiration. "Is he going to punish the bad guy?" Stephen asked. He smiled slightly. "Sometimes the punishment is having to see yourself." The boy didn't quite understand, but nodded. When the bus was almost empty, Stephen turned his gaze back to Clint. The man was no longer the same. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes red. The dried coffee on the floor was the perfect reminder of what had provoked his anger. "You know what the worst part of all this is?" Stephen said, crossing his arms. "What?" Clint replied, his voice breaking. "It's not what you did. It's what you did to yourself. You don't know anything about me. I know you've been here so long. Angry, you can't even remember why." The silence was longer than a confession. Clint didn't respond. He just gripped the steering wheel tightly, staring at his reflection in the windshield. He no longer saw a driver. He saw a defeated man. Stephen got off the bus without looking back. The sun greeted him with the same light that hours before had tested his patience. He walked to the sidewalk, stopped, and breathed. The sound of traffic returned. The world kept turning. Inside the bus, Clint remained motionless, staring at his empty cup. The video of the young man in the back was already circulating online. The title was simple: "The Man Who Stopped a Bus with a Single Glance." And although Stephen wasn't seeking fame, justice, or glory, he knew that sometimes a lesson without blows hurts more than any punishment. The day went on. But for Clint Jacobs, that journey never ended. Because some routes don't lead to any physical destination, they laid straight to the mirror. And that was the first confrontation, the moment an arrogant driver learned, in his own way, that you can't humiliate a man in peace. Without breaking down himself, the midday sun beat down relentlessly on the angels. The streets vibrated with heat, engines roared, and the asphalt seemed to melt beneath the wheels of the buses. It was a day like any other for everyone, except for Clint Jacobs. Since the incident with Steven Seagal, his life had become a constant echo of ridicule and headlines. Social media was ablaze. News programs repeated the clip over and over. Red light brown driver Steven Seagal, and collapses instantly. His name was synonymous with public shame. Clint slept, didn't eat, couldn't bear to look at himself in the mirror. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Steven's gaze, that calmness that had disarmed him without violence. But what tormented him most was something else. People no longer feared him, not his colleagues, not his boss, not even his own son, who had seen the video at school and said cruelly, "Dad, you're the one with the coffee." Meanwhile, Steven walked along Sunset Boulevard with his usual slow, measured gait. He wasn't wearing glasses, just a simple gray jacket. He looked like any other man, but everyone was looking at him differently. Now some people approached to thank him, others to take pictures. He smiled politely, but his eyes said something else. Femede didn't interest him. The lesson did. He passed a flower shop where an elderly woman was arranging tulips in the sun. Steven stopped, watched her, and remembered something. Years ago, his mother had also owned a small shop in the Boy Lakes neighborhood. It was there that he learned his first lesson in calmness. When a man loses his patience, she would tell him, he loses everything that makes him human. That phrase had been his compass ever since, but even men with a compass get lost. And that afternoon, the past was going to come back for him. In a small auto repair shop on the south side of town, Clint was arguing with two men in black jackets. One of them, a bald man with tattoos on his neck, was speaking to him in a voice low, poisonous. "You don't understand, Clint," he said. "That guy humiliated you in front of everyone, and now the world's laughing. If you don't do something, they're going to keep doing it." Clint took a deep breath. "And what do you want me to do?" "Hit him, that'd fix something." The man smiled. "No, but there are ways to even the score." Clint knew those men weren't friends. They were old acquaintances from a life he'd left behind, drivers, mechanics, and ex-convicts who worked for a small trucking syndicate that functioned more like an extortion ring. And among them was one he knew by the name Steven Seagal from another era. "Seagal," the bald man said with a laugh. "That guy worked with us back in the 90s. Cop, self-defense instructor, then special agent. Tough as nails, but also trouble for those of us in business. He screwed up more than one deal for us." Clint looked at him, confused. "Are you saying that man was a cop?" "He was more than that." The bald man lowered his voice. "He was the kind of guy who made you wish you were in jail instead of facing him." The silence grew heavy. Clint swallowed. "It can't be the same." "Oh, it is." The bald man lit a cigarette. "And if you want to redeem yourself, maybe you can give us a hand." Clint frowned. "What are you planning?" "Nothing big. Just reminding him that even the most stoic men can bleed." That night, Steven sat in his small apartment cleaning an old wristwatch. It was one of the few things he'd kept from his time on the force. The clock read 10:14. Outside, streetlights illuminated an empty, hot street. A television in the corner of the room showed his face on the news alongside blank headlines and laughter from morning shows. He turned off the screen. Silence returned until someone knocked on the door. 2 slow knocks, then a voice. "Mr. Seagal, excuse me, this is Clint Jacobs." Steven stood up slowly. His shadow stretched across the wall. He opened the door. There stood Clint, trembling, his eyes sunken, an envelope in his hand. "I need to talk to you," he said. "I'm not here to fight." Steven didn't reply, only nodded, letting him in. Clint placed the envelope on the table. "They want to hurt you," he whispered. "People who knew you before. They say you owe them something." Steven looked at him calmly. "And you?" I just wanted to apologize, but they used me. I told them about you. I told them where I lived." Stephen was silent for a few seconds. "So, they're coming." Clint lowered his head. "I'm sorry. I didn't know what I was getting myself into." Outside, the roar of an engine broke the stillness. Lights moved through the alleyways. Shadows. Stephen went to the window and saw 3 men getting out of a black van. Their footsteps echoed on the hot asphalt. One of them carried a crowbar, another a baseball bat. The third, the bald guy from the garage, carried a gun. "Stay back," Stephen said firmly. Clint took a step back, breathing rapidly. "I brought you here by accident, then help me by doing nothing." The door pounded. Stephen took off his jacket, folded it calmly, and laid it on the table. The clock still read 10:14. "Old habit," he muttered. "The violence always comes at the same time." The door was kicked open. The men burst in, shouting. The first one charged at Stephen, bat in hand. The blow was swift, but Stephen dodged it by barely twisting his torso. The wood slammed against the wall. With a swift movement, he grabbed the attacker's arm and bent it backward. The sound of bone breaking filled the apartment. The second man lunged with the crowbar. Stephen blocked it with his forearm, twisted his body, and took him down with a clean armbar. The bald man pointed his gun, but didn't fire because he saw something in Stephen's eyes. That stillness that precedes disaster. "I didn't come here to fight you," Stephen said, walking slowly toward him. "But you chose to come here to die." The bald man hesitated, and that hesitation was all Stephen needed. A twist, a blow to the forearm. The weapon fell to the ground. Another sharp, precise movement. The bald man ended up against the wall, breathing heavily. When it was all over, Clint was still trembling. The 3 men lay on the floor, not dead, but broken. Stephen wiped the blood from his knuckles with a towel. "I told you not to do anything." Clint nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "They were going to kill him." "No." Stephen looked at him. "They were going to test if he could still fight. And you tested him by bringing them here." In the ensuing silence, Clint stared at the bodies on the floor. Something inside him broke. "I just wanted them to respect me again." "Respect isn't bought with noise, Clint." Stephen put his watch in his pocket. "It's earned in silence." Clint slumped into a chair, defeated. Outside, sirens began to wail. Someone had called the police. Stephen put on his jacket. "When they come in," he said, "tell them the truth." Clint looked at him, confused. "And you?" "I've already had my punishment." His voice was deep, but calm, remembering what I was. When the patrol cars arrived, Stephen was gone. Only the spilled coffee, the stopped clock, and a driver who finally understood that violence doesn't fix what shame breaks remained. Night fell on Los Angeles with a thick, almost electric air. In the southern alleys, sirens could still be heard in the distance, blue echoes that stained the walls and shadows. Stephen's apartment was sealed off with police tape. Inside, the marks of the fight were still fresh. A dried pool of blood, a broken chair, and the metallic smell of sweat and fear. But Stephen Seagal was no longer there. He walked along Highway 110 with a serene gait, the headlights of cars reflecting in his sunglasses. His face was still, his mind in another time. That calm wasn't natural. It was forced, a calm built on blows, losses, and discipline. Inside him, the fire still burned. And what burned now was the certainty that you can't run from the past. Hours earlier, Clint Jacobs had been arrested. The police found him disoriented, surrounded by 3 unconscious men. His testimony was confused, almost delirious. I wasn't the one who attacked them. It was as if the air moved on its own. The officers looked at each other skeptically. The report was filed as self-defense under extenuating circumstances. But among the veteran officers, a rumor was growing. That name, Seagull, I've heard it before. And yes, in the old records of the Los Angeles Police Department, the name Steven Seagull appeared in a file marked in red. A special intervention unit disbanded in 1999 after a failed operation at the Long Beach port. Reason: disappearance of undercover officers, excessive use of force, and voluntary resignation before internal review. Now, 26 years later, Stephen was walking toward that same port. The wind smelled of salt and rust. The shipping containers, stacked like sleeping giants, blocked the moon. Each footstep echoed on the wet metal. In his mind, the faces of the fallen returned one by one. Colleagues, friends, and an enemy he never forgot. The same man who, according to rumors, now led the network that controlled the transportation unions in the city. Frank Colder, former commander, and the true mastermind behind the attack that had sent the men to Stephen's apartment. Stephen stopped in front of a blue dumpster with the logo erased. He knocked 3 times with his knuckles. A sharp sound answered from inside. Then the door opened. A woman was waiting for him. Short hair, a hard look, a fearless voice. "I knew you'd come back," she said. Stephen nodded without smiling. "Hi, Lara." It was his former partner, Lara Mendez, now a private analyst and owner of a small security firm. She had helped him disappear after '99, and now she was the only one who still knew where to find him. "They came for you," she said. 3 men and a message from Colder. "I already got them," Stephen replied. "Did you kill them?" "No, but they won't be able to walk the same way anymore." Lara watched him for a few seconds. "You know that if you go after Colder, there's no turning back?" "I didn't come to kill him." "Then what did you come for?" Stephen stared at her, his voice barely a whisper. "To shut down the port." That simple sentence carried a whole story. In 1999, the operation at the port of Long Beach had been a disaster. An illegal arms deal between the shipping union and a paramilitary group from the south. Stephen and his team intervened without backup. The result? 5 agents dead, 1 missing, Frank Colder, and an official cover-up that forced him to resign. The port remained an open wound in his memory. Now, 26 years later, the wound was bleeding again. In the old Warehouse 37, at midnight, Colder was counting money on a steel table. Around him, 4 armed men watched the corridors. A television was showing the news. The unsung hero of the bus, Steven Seagull, disappears after another altercation. Colder chuckled. "Look at him," said the old monk of violence. His laughter died away when he saw his own reflection on the screen. The scar on his cheek was still a reminder of that night in '99. One of his men approached. "Boss, there's movement on the docks. Police." "No, just someone walking." Colder smiled without surprise. "Let him through. I want to see him arrive." The imaginary camera moves through the shadows, the wind swaying the tarpaulins, the port lights blinking like eyes. And through all that silence, Steven Seagull appears. He walks straight ahead, no visible weapons. His figure is a block of calm amidst the industrial noise. The men watch him from a distance, aiming, hesitating. They don't know if they are about to arrest a man or unleash a storm. The former tries to approach. A split second, a movement, a hold. The guard falls without firing. The latter runs. A sharp blow. Silence. The others fall back. Stephen moves forward into the warehouse. Colder gets up from the table. His smile is that of someone who's been waiting for this moment for half his life. "I knew you'd come," he says as he sees him enter. Stephen doesn't answer. He just observes the place, the boxes, the lights, the smell. Everything the same as that night. So many years running from who you are. Calder continues. "But the world doesn't change, Seagull. There will always be trash, and someone will have to take it out." "Not with your methods," Stephen finally replies. "My methods." Calder laughs. "I learned them from you." The tension is cut by the whir of a lamp. They look at each other like two ghosts who owe each other something, and Calder, without warning, pulls out a gun. The shot pierces the air, but the sound is too late. Stephen has already moved. The bullet grazes his shoulder, ricochets off a beam. In the same second, Stephen strikes Calder's hand, disarms him, pins him to the table. Her breathing is slow, controlled, the entire past compressed into a single instant. "It could kill you." He says, "Do it this way, and you'll end up where you started." Stephen closes his eyes and lets go. Calder falls to the ground, gasping. "You didn't dare," he spits. "You're still the coward who wouldn't shoot in '99. Stephen turns toward the exit. "I don't need to prove anything to you." "Then watch," Calder says, pressing a remote control. An explosion rocks the dock. Fire erupts among the containers. Smoke fills the sky. Stephen falls to the ground, stunned. Alarms blare, sirens, screams, chaos. And through the flames, a shadow moves away. Calder, unharmed, laughing, disappears into the smoke. Stephen gets up slowly, his face covered in Olin. The port is burning, but he doesn't run. He walks toward the fire, in the direction Calder fled. His gaze holds no anger, only purpose. "Let's finish this," he murmurs. And so, in the glow of the blazing fire, the man who once swore never to fight again takes his first step toward his final battle. Dawn was slowly breaking over Los Angeles. The port's smoke still hung in the air like a thick fog. From the rooftops, the columns of fire looked like blazing scars on a city that pretended not to see its wounds. Amid the smoldering wreckage, a man walked. Gray jacket, face blackened by Eloyin, gaze fixed on the horizon. Stephen Seagull. His footsteps crunched on the hot metal, each movement accompanied by the echo of a past he no longer wanted to carry. The port was in ruins, containers ripped open, trucks charred, seagulls circling over the black water. In the air, the mingled smell of gasoline, salt, and memory. Stephen stopped at the edge of the pier. He looked at his reflection in the water, distorted by the ripples. He looked like a different man, one who had lived through too many wars, one who had nothing left to prove. Hours earlier, he had chased Frank Calder through the flames. The former commander knew every corner of the port, every passageway, every rusty staircase. And yet, Stephen caught up with him. The confrontation was brief, brutal, inevitable. Calder fired. First, bullets struck the containers, sending sparks flying. Stephen advanced silently, like a shadow refusing to die. When he was close enough, he took him down with a chokehold, the same one he'd used 20 years ago in his training. They both fell to the ground amidst the fire and metal debris. The weapon rolled away. They stood face to face. Calder's eyes reflected a mixture of fear and admiration. "You were always the best," he gasped, "but also the biggest coward." Stephen didn't answer. His breathing was calm, deep, cowardly. "Yes, because you don't know how to finish what you start." Calder spat blood. "Your problem is that you think the world can change without getting your hands dirty." Stephen watched him for a few seconds. Fire crackled around them. And then, with an almost compassionate gesture, he gave him the same answer that had haunted him his entire life. "I've already proven otherwise." He stood up, turning his back on Calder, and walked away, leaving him lying amidst the sparks and smoke. Now, in the calm of dawn, Stephen understood what he had done. He hadn't killed him, but he hadn't saved him either. He had let the fire decide. Silence was his only companion. And in that silence, for the first time, there was no guilt. From his pocket, he took out the old watch. It was broken, stopped at the time of the attack. 10-1, the very moment his past had come back to haunt him. He held it between his fingers and threw it into the water. The watch sank slowly until it disappeared beneath the surface. Hours later, firefighters and police arrived at the scene. Among the rubble, they found several bodies. One of them, unrecognizable, was attributed to Calder. The authorities closed the case as an industrial accident. No one mentioned Steven Seagal. Not even the reporters who, weeks earlier, had hailed him as an internet hero, ever spoke his name again. It was as if the man had never existed. Only Clint Jacobs still remembered him. The driver, now free on bail, watched the news from his small apartment. The screen showed images of the burning port. He said nothing. He turned off the television, went to the window, and took a deep breath. On his table was a cup of coffee, this time cold. He didn't throw it away. He just stared at it and smiled sadly, because he finally understood that the stranger who had boarded his bus wasn't an enemy. He was a mirror, one that showed him who he had been and who he could stop being. Elsewhere in the city, far from the noise and lights, Stephen stood on a hill overlooking the entire valley. He carried a small backpack, wore a clean shirt, and his hands were bandaged with makeshift dressings. Dawn enveloped him in golden hues, and for the first time in many years, his breathing sounded free. Lara Mendez silently reached him. "I looked everywhere for you," she said. Stephen didn't look at her. "I never left. I just changed direction." Lara watched him, trying to guess what he was thinking. "What are you going to do now?" Stephen stared at the horizon. "Nothing, nothing." He nodded. "Sometimes the hardest thing isn't fighting, it's stopping." Lara smiled wearily. "And if they come looking for you again, they won't find me." "Why are you so sure?" Stephen turned away, his gaze serene. "Because I'm not the one they're looking for anymore." A long silence enveloped them. The wind stirred the tall grass. A hawk crossed the sky. Lara took a step back, knowing it was time to let him go. Stephen grabbed his jacket, slung it over his shoulder, and started walking down the hill. Each step took him further from the noise, the name, the past. In the following days, rumors began to circulate. Someone saw him in a small northern town, repairing motorcycles. Others said he was traveling on a train toward the border, helping the elderly and children. No one had a photograph. No one had proof. Only stories. Stories of a silent man with a deep gaze who always appeared where there was chaos and left when everything returned to calm. The camera rises, revealing the immensity of the city at dawn. The fires have died down. The streets are filling up again. The world keeps turning, and amidst this noise, an inner voice. Stephen's, or perhaps that of the invisible narrator, whispers, "Violence doesn't disappear, it just changes hands. But if you learn not to use it, then silence becomes your strongest weapon." The wind blows, the sun rises, and on an empty road, a man walks alone, unhurried, nameless, without a shadow. The sound of a bus engine passes in the distance. a new driver, a new route. Everything continues as if nothing had happened, as if it had all been necessary. Cut to black. Total silence.